I love the passage we heard in today's first reading as Moses is talking to the people and reminding them about what is most important. He says that following God is not too mysterious or too remote. It's not far away. He says knowing how to follow God is inside you, already in your mouths and in your hearts. You have only to carry it out. Those were some of Moses' last words to his people. He was 120 years old at that point, and he thought he might be nearing the end of his life. He'd been with them through so much, from being in slavery in Egypt, to hearing God call him in the burning bush, to going back to Egypt and telling Pharaoh to let God's people go, to leading the people from slavery to freedom through the Red Sea, to receiving the 10 Commandments from God, and then carrying them down the mountain to find the people had made this golden calf to worship. And as a result of that, spending the next 40 years wandering with the people in the desert. After all of that, Moses says that the most important thing is very simple. We know what to do. That simple command is what Jesus and the scholar of the law are discussing in the gospel reading. The gospel commandment is to love God with everything we have, and to love our neighbor as ourselves. That is very simple and yet very hard to live out. We complicate our lives with so many different things that get in the way of those two great commandments. And yet Moses is right. It is very simple if following those commandments becomes the most important thing in our lives. We want to simply allow those commandments and living them become who we are. And while that's simple, it doesn't just happen. We can say that we love God and love our neighbor all we want, but that doesn't make it true. It takes time and work. Like any relationship, our relationship with God is only going to be good if we spend a lot of time with God, so we get to know who God is, so that God can rub off on us. God helps us with this, though. We are made in God's image and likeness. And if we work at it, we can allow God to have this happen even more naturally within us. When we do something over and over and over, it becomes a habit. We all have good habits and bad habits. The good ones we have to work at. We have to practice doing what is right for it to become more naturally a part of who we are. But once we do that, that happens. The parable of the Good Samaritan shows how that is true. The priest and the Levite were the ones who supposedly knew God, and yet they had other things on their minds or were too afraid to stop and help this person in need on the side of the road. They walked on by. They hadn't yet allowed loving others to become a natural part of who they were. How different the Samaritan was. He did have good reason not to get involved. He was a foreigner and should have been afraid. Others could easily have accused him and his help as trying to rob or harm the man. And yet he was the one that did the right thing. He just knew that he was going to help someone in need. My guess is that he had a deep relationship with God that allowed him to be ready to do the right thing whenever that moment occurred. Often we find many excuses to not do the right thing. Fear is a primary one. We're afraid of people who are not like us. We're afraid of being too generous. We're afraid of letting God change us. It's much easier to keep God at a distance, to stay in charge ourselves, for us to be in control of our time, our energy, our money. When we let our fears dominate, we will not develop the habit to do that right thing naturally. Doing the right thing is not hard, but we do need to be intentional about it. Those good habits that we develop are called virtues. Virtues are things that we work on so that we can do the right thing. They help us to get to the point of loving God and our neighbor in such a way that it simply becomes who we are. These days, we need to see that connection between loving God and loving our neighbor. Our faith becomes real only when we live that way, when we take the time to allow God to change us, when we practice doing the right thing so that those right things become habits and virtues, simply who we are. Isn't that what we want, who we want to be? To know that our love of God and our neighbor is something very near to us, already in our mouths and in our hearts, and we need only to carry it out.